This week, I just want to briefly talk about the camera settings that I use on this camera. This is the Lumix G7, as well as why I use them, what the different settings do, and how your settings might change depending on what you're doing. So let's start out with what is most noticeable, which is the picture profile or picture setting. Picture profile basically dictates the contrast, saturation, and sharpness of the image coming out of your camera. I use what's called a flat picture setting, which basically means that the contrast, sharpness, and saturation are as low as they can be coming out of the camera. The camera isn't adding anything. So as you can see, the image looks very washed out. There's very little contrast and sharpness, and it doesn't look that good. But even though it doesn't look great right now, the advantage of shooting with a setting like this is that it gives you a lot of room. It preserves detail, and you can then edit, color grade, and add that back in. Now, I like to color grade all of my footage. I like to mess with the colors, with the contrast, and because of that, since I have time for that, it's advantageous for me to have all of that extra detail and to retain as much information as possible to work with later. But say your process is a little bit different, you want to be able to just turn on your camera and get a good shot. Say you make videos every single day, you don't necessarily have time to edit like that. In that situation, you might be better off with something like your camera's standard picture profile, which adds a little bit of contrast, a little bit of saturation to the image. However, even if you have the contrast and saturation turned up a bit, I would definitely recommend turning down the sharpness, because I guarantee you your camera's sharpness looks absolutely terrible. Picture setting stays the same for every shot. No matter what I'm filming, I'm using that flat, low contrast profile, but there are a lot of other settings that you'll need to change depending on what you're filming. One of those is frame rate. If you don't know what frame rate is, go look it up because it's complicated and I don't have enough time to explain it in this video. But basically, when I'm shooting something like this, where I'm talking to the camera, I shoot in 24 frames per second. That's the most smooth cinematic frame rate that you can use, and I don't need to shoot anything higher because I don't intend to slow this down. That would just look weird. But when I'm shooting B-roll or cinematic footage, I'll shoot in 60 frames per second. That's just so that I can slow the footage down in post and get a smoother camera motion. So 24 frames per second for vlogging or talking to the camera, 60 frames for everything else. Now, I shoot with my camera in completely manual mode, meaning that the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are completely set by me. The camera doesn't set any of that automatically. For photography, having an automatic shutter speed or an automatic aperture can be alright. That can be helpful if you have to shoot quickly. But for shooting video, you really want to have those all set to manual so that you don't have anything changing in the middle of the shot. If you have anything set to be automatically set by the camera, then it can change in the middle of the shot. So you're going to have your shot getting brighter and darker while you're filming, and that's not something you want. That makes it difficult to color grade. It looks weird sometimes. Normally, I'll keep the aperture at the lowest the lens can go, just so that I have the most depth of field that I can possibly have, and then I'll adjust the shutter speed to make it brighter or darker, and then only raise the ISO when necessary. You won't notice it on this lens since it's wide angle, but if you're using something like a telephoto lens, then having that higher shutter speed can make your footage a little bit wobbly. If you want to correct for that, then you can buy something called an ND filter. You've heard it before. It's basically sunglasses for your camera, darkens the image so that you can turn the aperture and the shutter speed both down, and then since your shutter speed is lower, you don't get that wobble effect. Another setting that I keep on manual is white balance. This basically dictates the orange or blue tint given to your footage based on the conditions that you're shooting in. So sunlight is slightly blue, so your camera's going to add a bit of orange in to make it look white. Indoor lighting and incandescent lighting is orange, so your camera's going to add some blue to make it look white. And your camera will make it as simple as that. Just change your white balance setting to the condition that you're shooting in. I'm shooting outside, so I'll set it to daylight. If I go inside, I'll set it to incandescent. This avoids having any kind of cast on the image. Like if I go, here's this shot set to incandescent lighting. This would look perfectly fine if I was shooting indoors, but because of that blue tint, the image is completely blue. You don't want that. And while it may be a little bit tempting to put this on automatic and not have to worry about it, that will make your life, when color grading, an absolute nightmare. You won't have to change your white balance nearly as often as you change your shutter speed or your aperture, so just keep it on manual and you'll have complete consistency throughout your shots. This camera does have the option to shoot in 4K, but I barely ever do, just because the footage takes up more space, it's harder to edit, and I have better things to do with my time than spend that time down-resing the footage to 1080 so that I can edit it. Having the extra sharpness, the extra crispness of detail is nice, but I don't think it's really worth all of the extra time that I spend getting that. I keep my camera on silent mode so there are no beeps, no shutter clicking sounds, but I only take it off of silent mode if I'm shooting a long exposure or a time lapse. For whatever reason, you're not able to leave your shutter open for more than I think 1 second on silent mode, so keep that in mind if you want to shoot a time lapse and have that motion blur, or shoot something like a long exposure photograph, then take it off of silent mode. But for just about everything else, there's really no reason to not have it on silent mode. You won't be bothering anyone or scaring off any animals. Since I'm shooting video, most of my lenses are manual. They don't have autofocus, so I don't use my camera's autofocus. But on the off chance that I'm using a lens that does have autofocus, I have it set to face tracking. That just seems to be the fastest and most accurate one. But most of the time for video, you're not going to want to use autofocus. You can just turn it off, because having that focus drifting around in your video can be distracting, especially if you're shooting a cinematic. Regardless of whether you are using autofocus or not, having peaking turned on will help you out a ton. Basically what the G7's peaking setting does is it displays a blue line around the edges of things that are in focus. It's not perfect, but if you're moving quickly, it's a good visual, fast indication that something is in focus. Now, while we're on the topic of what your camera displays alongside the live preview, I don't use the histogram, but I do have peaking turned on. Now, what peaking does is it has a little pattern that it overlays to indicate areas that are completely white. So as you can see, there's a little spot in the top of this shot that's completely white, and if I look at the camera monitor, I can see that there's a little striped zebra type pattern over that. It's a really fast, effective visual indication that your shot is overexposed. I also have this rule of thirds guideline enabled just to help with composition, as well as a little marker in the center of the screen for when I'm pushing towards something and want to keep it in the middle. Having your guidelines turned on like that can also be extremely helpful for shooting hyperlapses. One setting that I recommend you change no matter what is your eye sensor sensitivity. The G7 has this really cool feature where if you put your eye up to the viewfinder, it switches automatically to the electronic viewfinder. It's great that when I want to switch to the viewfinder, the camera just magically switches to it for me, but it is way too sensitive. If you just get your hand close enough or move it in front of that viewfinder sensor, the live view cuts off. So just find the eye sensor settings in your menu and then turn that sensitivity to low. I have shoot without lens enabled just in case I want to take the lens off of the camera to get some cool tilt shift shots. And I have my monitor brightness set to standard, so it's not going to change any. And standard is good because you're not draining your battery, but you can still see your camera screen. Finally, just a few settings for the microphone. I have the input level turned down to -4 just to avoid peaking. I have both the limiter and the wind cut on to cut out the background noise, and I have the mic level display set to be displayed on the screen so I can just make sure that my camera is recording audio and not peaking. And that is it for this week's tutorial. I hope you liked the change of scenery, hope you found the video informative, and if you did, do feel free to show your support by leaving a like on the video or even subscribing to my channel. I upload new filmmaking and video editing tutorials every single Saturday. Keep creating, and I will see you in the next one. Yes, I replaced my desk. Do you like it? I like it. Anyway, see you in the next video. Bye.